use and/or view at your own risk. Alright, in this video what we're going to do is show you how to professionally apply CPU grease or CPU thermal grease. What you'll need before you get started is a pair of scissors, an old credit card, smooth sides only, that's on both sides, a couple of Q-tips, plastic applicator or plastic shafts, some kind of a lint-free cloth. You'll also need at least, we can get this into focus, 91% alcohol, or preferably denatured alcohol. A couple of pairs of plastic or surgical gloves, and some sort of lint-free brush. I always use a horsehair brush because that leaves the least lint. Now the reason that you use CPU thermal grease or CPU grease is to actually fill in the gaps where the CPU heatsink has been ground. Now most of these things are what's known as automatically ground, so they're not ground within a couple of tenths, and actually if they were, they would be so flat that once they contacted the stamped cover on the CPU, and that's where you see your CPU writing like Intel E6500, 2 megabyte cache, all that good stuff. If they were actually ground as flat as they need to be, or flat enough to where they wouldn't require CPU grease, you would have what's known as flat surface adhesion, for just put it in a layman's term. And what that means is both surfaces are so flat they'd actually adhere to each other, and you'd have a really hard time getting the CPU cooler back off the top of your CPU. You would probably even pull off the cover of your CPU, the metal part of your CPU, which that wouldn't be good. So I don't know if this will show up on the camera. I'll try to tilt it, but you should see grind marks. And you can also see a little bit of imperfections where the actual CPU cooler was ground. And that is what your CPU grease is actually for, is to fill in those tiny microscopic scratches. When you machine something, you have there's something known as the surface roughness, and that's what you're filling in, because you want an absolute flat surface between the cooler and the top of your CPU. So that is the whole purpose for CPU thermal grease. You also, depending on how hot your CPU runs, you may want to see what the thermal resistance is. I can't even remember what you call it, but different thermal greases or CPU thermal greases have different abilities to cool your CPU. And so if you got a real hot CPU, you really want to go, and I would suggest some kind of silver based and not latex based CPU grease. But I've got a latex based CPU grease here because I just was in a hurry. I've got a couple of machines I need to build out, and it'll be fine. As long as you apply it correctly, you'll be just fine. We'll see if we can get a little bit better shot of the surface roughness of the CPU cooler, or the block, the aluminum block, so you can see what that thermal grease is actually filling in. Alright. Now the first thing we want to do is make an applicator. Now sometimes when you buy CPU grease, it'll come with a little paddle, little stick looking thing, looks like a what you put a pizza in an oven with, a little tiny paddle that you can dig the CPU grease out of the jar or little container that it comes in. Now, as you've seen before, I've got the syringe type, so I can just mash out as much as I need. I don't like those little paddles. They're usually kind of thick, and they're not flexible enough, in my opinion, to actually get the amount of pressure that you want to put on the applicator to get as thin a layer as possible of CPU grease on the top of your CPU. You also want to make sure that you apply your CPU thermal grease to the top of your CPU and not to the bottom of the actual cooler itself. And the reason being is a lot of times those coolers are larger than the surface of the top of the CPU cover, and so we just want it on the CPU itself. And you also want to try to minimize flashing, which is adding too much CPU thermal grease, and therefore it'll flash over the edges of the cover of the CPU, and that'll actually contain heat instead of dissipating it, because it's like putting a blanket on the edges of those, or the edges of the top of the CPU cover, and there's not a CPU cooler coming in contact with it, even if it is through that CPU thermal grease, and therefore it acts like a little thermal barrier and holds heat in. I'll show you a little bit more on that later. So the very first thing we want to do is make an applicator, and what you want to do, you can see I've got kind of skinny fingers, so I can get away with a little bit smaller, from making a little bit smaller applicator. Just make it to the size that you're comfortable with your fingers. Alright, so what we'll do is we'll just cut us a piece of this credit card off around here. No, we don't need that anymore. Take and make you 2 cuts, just small, on either side, and then bend it. And what we're going to do, what that allows you to do, is have a little handle to drag the, get it in camera here, to drag the CPU grease applicator. And so you'll just put it down and drag it like that, and spread your grease out as you're putting it on. So that's our first little tool that we need to make. The Q-tips are to remove any flashing or any excess CPU grease from the edges, like I just got through explaining to you. But you'll need one, cut one end of the Q-tip off, and you can see it's kind of hollow inside. If you've got a really sharp knife, you can take and cut it even further and just get a tiny little, let's see if I can get this, make like a tiny little spoon. And what we're going to do with that is remove any excess grease off of our applicator, so we can put it back down on the top of our CPU and therefore not waste any thermal grease. See if I can get this in camera. It's not going to help you much if I don't. Alright, so see here, it's hard to see. It's a little bit of a dark background. You see I've got it kind of a little radius in there, so I'll go ahead and cut it back a little bit further. Pull that excess up. Cut that off. Flatten this out. I have no idea, so how much is showing up here. I'll just have to see afterwards. And make a nice little flat surface that we can scrape any excess CPU grease, like I said, off of the applicator and put it back down on the CPU, and then go about spreading it again. Alright, now what we'll do is we'll move on to what we need, our 91%. Please only use 91%. Now what that is the percentage of alcohol versus the percentage of water in the alcohol solution, water alcohol solution, whatever you want to call it. And when the alcohol evaporates, if you use a lower percentage of alcohol, it will evaporate and leave hard water spots, and that's what you don't want at all. That's why I prefer, or the best thing to use, is what's known as denatured alcohol, which has all the water removed out of it, but you really can't get that anymore because of our certain political circumstances at the moment, which is kind of ridiculous, but that's how it is. So just take your alcohol, get some sort of a lint-free cloth. Just put a little dab on it. You don't need a whole lot. All we're trying to do is make sure that the surface that we're going to apply the CPU grease to is clean, and clean your CPU cooler itself, or the CPU cooling block itself. Clean that off and try to dry it. Flip it over and make sure you dry it. That will also minimize any hard water spotting that may occur. Do the same thing to the top of your CPU or the CPU cover, and then that'll be done there. And then the next step that we'll need to do is to actually apply our grease. I recommend using gloves just to keep the grease, the thermal grease, off of your hands. Mostly it's non-toxic, but you know, I've lived a long time, and it turns out that most things they tell you is non-toxic turns out 15 years later to be toxic. So safety first. Alright, I'm kind of having to run the camera backwards here so you can get an idea of what's going on. So what we're going to do is actually flip our little lint-free cloth inside out, wipe off the top of the CPU like I said before, and dry it off. And then here's where our lint-free brush, like I said, I use horsehair, and you can see it, the alcohol dissipate, and just lightly brush it and make sure you don't have any lint on it. Do the same thing to the top of your, I get my CPU cooler in here. Just do the same thing to the top of your CPU cooler. Make sure there's no lint on that. Okay. Now we'll just simply apply our grease. Go ahead and see if I can get this in camera. You don't want to use but just a tiny amount. So I actually put a little bit more than I care for. Kind of came out on me too quick. Cover back on. The little applicator that we made. This may be hard to see, but I think I've explained things well enough to where you can get a general idea of what we're doing. You can spread it. You want to try to keep your applicator as flat as possible. Go ahead, spread it out. Take your time. Not in a terrible rush. Like I said, you want to try to keep. You want to use 2 fingers if you can. I'm probably blocking the camera. Try to use 2 fingers. Get even pressure all the way down. That'll help you spread it out, you see. Spread. Because the grooves that we're trying to fill in where that CPU cooler was ground are microns. Mostly. You know, and if they're any larger than that, I would highly suggest you go get you a new cooler. Now you should be able to see how much excess CPU grease we got left on the applicator itself. Oh, grabbed the wrong one. And you can see, hopefully you can see where I made a little spoon. And you can take and drag any excess grease and try to get it back off the applicator. Actually, there's hardly any excess left on that one. And I'll just have to add a little bit more thermal grease to this corner here. This stuff here is pretty thin. So depending on the thickness, you just have to be careful about how much you add and how much you don't add. And just go about doing the same thing again, the same process again. see here, maybe there's a little ridge of excess grease here. So what we're going to try to do is get that laid right there. You basically just want to paint it on. And that's looking pretty good. It's a little bit thicker than I'd like and not as smooth as I'd like, but that's okay too. You don't have to be perfect. You just want to be as thin as possible. Your last time, take and drag your CPU grease from one side to the exact opposite side, and then we'll clean up excess on one side. Got that there. We'll come and make a cleanup swipe here on this very edge here, and boom, you're done. And I got that one pretty good. But what you want to do is, if you got a bunch of excess, is take your Q-tip and run it right around the edges of the CPU cover and help minimize any flashing. If you remove a little bit on the edge there, like I just did, don't worry about it. It's not that big a deal. When you lay the CPU cooler on it, you can even take, and if I can get this in camera, and kind of mash out the end of your Q-tip a little bit, thin that cotton out, and get it right down from just the edge. And now you're ready to lay your CPU down, or your CPU cooler, I'm sorry. Now I noticed that it's probably hard to see on camera, but I've got a little smudge right on the bracket that holds the CPU down. So just take my lint-free cloth with some alcohol on it and clean any of that up. What you want to do is use that thermal grease to fill in the gaps again, and make sure that there's no excess, which is actually going to hold heat in. Looking pretty good. Just use a Q-tip, probably the best thing to use for that. I didn't have very much, so I got that. We'll take a little better look at the top of the CPU cover and see if we can't show you how it should look. Cooler, and this happens to be a Dell machine, and it's an Optiplex machine, and of course, you know, your coolers may be different and they may lay down different. This one has a little bracket here that you'll set one edge of the cooler, or the actual cooler holder, down into, and then you will fold it down and on top of your CPU. So we'll go ahead and do that and make sure everything's out of the way. Any kind of cords coming off your power supply, or any kind of hard drive, SATA drive, cables, and just simply rock it down and on it. And then you can kind of grab it, just wiggle it just a little tiny bit, and then take your screwdriver and just go a couple of turns at a time. Make sure you're down into the hole of the motherboard. If you are using a CPU cooler that has 4 bolts, make sure you alternate diagonally from bolt to bolt. So if the top bolt was 1, the one to the very right of it was 2, the bottom bolt was 3, and the one to the right of it was 4, you would go 1, 4, 2, and 3. And alternate that away. Probably don't want to use more than about 5 foot-pounds of pressure. Once it gets tightened all the way up, you just want to tighten it up enough that as the CPU heats up while it's in use and then cools back down, the bolts don't loosen. And basically, that's all there is to it. Now what you'll need to do after you get this done is turn your computer on, of course, go into the BIOS and check the actual CPU temperature. And then you'll need to go online and get the data sheet for your CPU and make sure it's running within operating temperature. Mostly the data sheets won't tell you the maximum operating temperature. Of course, just make sure you blow that. Alright? And thank you for watching.